Hey everyone. On the day this conference call was recorded, we were having really heavy rain. And since Trent and I live in a yurt, it was super, super loud. Because of this, the first part of the recording has really poor audio quality. But the contents of the meeting were so valuable that even though it takes a long time to caption a video this long, I wanted to provide closed captions so that nothing would be missed. With that said, if you find you're unable to clearly understand what's being spoken, please turn on the captions, and we hope you are very blessed by the contents of the meeting.
Today is May 25, 2018, and we are going to be discussing various issues related to our recent new moon topic, which we actually continued on through our last weekend as well, which is concerning the character of God as manifest through the historical Jesus. And again, emphasis on historical. And so, anyway, in our past meetings on this so far, there hasn't been much opportunity for back and forth discussion. So that's what we hope to do here. So anyway, let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for helping us to unlearn many things and to learn many new things. Guide our discussion tonight. Help us to contemplate these subjects and seek to find how they really impact us and help us to be rid of all of our biases and preconceptions and be able to deal with reality on its own merits and really help us to see your character more fully than ever before so that we can cooperate with you and so that we can bring an end to the kingdom of darkness. Thank you so much for love and truth. Guide us. We ask this in the name of Grant, she and she. Amen. Amen. Okay, so I'm assuming that most people on the call remember our discussion so far. I'll recap it a little bit more just as a refresher. So, as I already mentioned, the topic has been seeing the character of God the Father and also the whole heavenly family more clearly through the lens of the historical Jesus. And part of this has to do with the new moon topic prior to the most recent one, where we look at the gospel of truth, a text that is known to us through the Nag Hammadi find, and which comes from the early centuries of belief in Jesus. We do not know precisely to when it is to be dated, nor do we know exactly who wrote it, but it contains many interesting and important principles that definitely parallel in a striking way the teachings of Ellen White regarding the origin of sin, and also the emphasis of the present message concerning the nature of truth and the role of truth in bringing about salvation from sin. So with that topic in mind, we have been seeking ever since the new moon of the first month for this year in the Hebrew calendar to better understand the character of God. We've taken that investigation over into studying the historicity of the Exodus and considering the various sources within the Bible concerning the Exodus and the different pictures that they portray and how that reflects the character of God. And then with this most recent new moon, we have focused on how Jesus is our revelation of the character of his Father in particular, but again, the whole heavenly family indeed. And we talked about the need of studying the historical Jesus and how really Jesus, his own life and ministry in the first century, as it was in reality, is really what we need to get to, rather than simply going by a traditional text that we may have received and what it says about Jesus. And in kind of unpacking what that means, we have really had to backtrack a bit in terms of reviewing what we have learned in this message And I'll briefly mention some of these things right now. We have learned that the idea of a scripture canon or a biblical canon is in fact not scriptural, nor is it heaven ordained, nor is it helpful. And in fact, it can be and is oftentimes very harmful. And as it relates to the Gospels in the New Testament, there have been many traditions that have built up in relation to the Gospels in the New Testament, even in terms of who wrote them. The Gospels in the New Testament do not claim to have been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, though that is the traditional perspective within Christianity. But since we have learned that we need to prove all things and hold fast to that which is good, we can no longer hold on to that tradition since it is unsubstantiated. Furthermore, we have learned that these texts, to our knowledge, to the best that we can find in reading them and trying to take them for what they themselves say, we don't see any indication in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John that they claim to have been written by someone who claims to be a spokesperson for God, or who claims to be a prophet, or who claims to be writing under divine inspiration. And so in that regard, understanding that the idea of the canon is not actually a true or a good idea, we have learned that in addition to being willing to consider texts that are outside of Christian canons, we also have to be willing to test the writings which are contained within the Christian canon. And that includes the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in testing them thus far, we have found that none of them can actually be viewed as being 100% historically accurate, and they do actually disagree with each other on historical details, and that leaves us in a place where if we want to know, in fact, what Jesus was like, what he did, what he said, we need to use these sources, indeed, as sources, but we cannot uncritically accept everything they say as reflecting historical reality. And I will also add that even if there is something that does not accurately reflect a historical reality, that does not mean that it is saying something that is a lie or something that isn't true. Even something that isn't true may not be a lie because someone may be saying something that, to the best of their knowledge, is true. They may be attempting to tell the truth, though they may be mistaken. So some of the historical inaccuracies in some of the Gospels may be due to the fact that they were depending upon other sources, which themselves may not have been 100% historically reliable. Furthermore, there are instances where Gospel writers teach things that are in fact true, though do not reflect a historical reality. And an example of that is the Gospel of John's portrayal of Jesus as publicly declaring himself to be the I am, to be God, incarnate in flesh. Now we have to understand that that is something that is true, that Jesus is actually the incarnation of the pre-existent Son of God. However, on a historical basis, it is not actually the case that Jesus himself, in history, the real person walking around in Judea and Galilee, it is simply not the case that he was going around publicly making statements like before Abraham was, I am. And we can determine that because when we consider the conflicting pictures of Jesus' portrayal of himself in our Gospels in the New Testament, we have, for example, Mark, which says that Jesus was secretive about his own identity, and he actually forbade his disciples from even publicly proclaiming his messiahship, which is a lower claim than divinity. So in Mark, he doesn't make any divine claims. He does believe himself to be the Messiah in Mark, but he even forbids his disciples from proclaiming him to be the Messiah. So that portrayal is irreconcilably different from the portrayal in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is constantly, as the primary subject of his public discourse, is proclaiming himself to be pre-existent and indeed to be divine. Now, we believe that Jesus is divine and that Jesus did pre-exist his incarnate life as Jesus of Nazareth. But did he proclaim that vocally as we get portrayed in the Gospel of John? Historically speaking, no. Jesus did not actually say those words. And again, we have to keep in mind that these ancient writings were all written in time before the birth of modern historiography. So these ancient writers didn't even have the concept of history that we have. And that's not actually a bad thing in and of itself. Like, that's not wrong. In fact, in order to get across certain deep lessons, sometimes it's important to go beyond a rigid historiography. For example, in The Desire of Ages, Ellen White describes the life of Jesus. And there are several times throughout The Desire of Ages where Ellen White says, Jesus said, and then she goes on quoting Jesus in first person as it were. But she has him saying things which no one would suggest that Jesus of history actually said. When you read Desire of Ages, it's really clear that she's trying to expand the content of his sayings in order to more clearly get across the principle which should have been evident through his words and actions to those who witnessed them during his life.
Can I interject a quick comment?
Sure.
I'm so glad you're putting it that way because I can see that being so helpful for Adventists and Davidians in hearing something like this possibly for the first time. You know, people come across the YouTube channel all the time and they may listen to this study without hearing anything else prior or not enough prior to really have a foundation built to understand why you're saying the things you're saying.
Absolutely.
And they might think you're saying something different than what you're actually saying. But to illustrate with Ellen White as an example of how she says that Jesus said, "Thus and thus and thus." Well, if time should last for another 2,000 years and somebody read what she wrote and they understood her to be a prophet and thought, okay, this is inspiration, and let's say it's part of the Bible,
Right.
They're going to think, oh, that Jesus said that. Exactly. But we don't think that she's quoting him word for word. You're right. So why would it be any different, especially when the authors of the Gospels and the New Testament don't even claim inspiration? I'm not saying they're not inspired, but they don't claim inspiration. Other people claim it from him, but they don't claim it themselves. But Ellen White claimed for herself to be inspired. So it's okay to realize that she's not quoting word for word what Jesus actually said historically, but that definitely he said, in principle, most of what she's getting across, then it's really no different to say, okay, well, we don't have to believe that Jesus is being quoted here by John or somebody. What was John trying to convey? Well, John's trying to convey a message, and he's using this method. He's not trying to say, oh, look, I'm getting close to Jesus saying. So anyway, just like
oh, that's great, absolutely. And it's the same sort of thing where if you watch a movie and it says at the very beginning based on a true story, well, you expect that it's generally going to reflect the story as it was. But you know that in order to tell the story, to be a good storyteller, if you're just going off of the rigid bare facts information that you can deduce using modern historical methods, you cannot tell a story as a story that draws people in and gets across certain things by doing it. It would be more like a report. And so when you watch one of these movies, based on a true story, you understand that what you see and hear from the actors playing the parts of the individuals who are actually involved in the event, that all of that does not reflect word for word, action for action, exactly what happened. There may be some instances where you have that. Like if you watch a movie about Martin Luther King Jr., well, yeah, when they come to his speech in Washington, there are going to be certain words and phrases that they will use, like "I have a dream," that will be actually word for word. But by and large, that's not going to be the case. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the gospel accounts that we have differ from each other in wording. Even when they are remarkably similar, they are often different in wording. So if we want to say this is word for word what Jesus said, well, which one? Is it the way that it is in Mark, the way that it is in Matthew, the way that it is in Luke, the way that it is in John? Because they do differ. So we just need to remember not to view these writings as anything other than what they claim to be. And in addition to not claiming to be products of divine inspiration and not claiming to have been written by apostles, the Gospels in the New Testament do not claim to be written by eyewitnesses. The Gospel of John, as my little qualifier here, may in fact be claiming to be based on the testimony of an eyewitness, whether that testimony was in a written form or in a verbal form. That's something to be studied more. But there are definitely things within the Gospels that are historically reliable and that you can show to trace back to the historical Jesus, the person, but it's not historically reliable in every regard. And so we have to approach it with the understanding that in order to use these writings to understand in history, in the reality of the past, what Jesus said and did, we have to not just brush on the surface. We have to dig deeper into what they say and use methods that enable us to determine what is likely historical, what is not. And in our past three meetings, last Friday and Saturday night, and also Thursday during the day, which was our most recent new moon, we did some of that in regard to really the first element of Jesus' own ministry, and that is his connection to John the Baptist. And we looked at what the Gospels in the New Testament, and even a bit beyond the New Testament, as in also we looked at something in the Gospel of Thomas, we looked at a little bit in the Apocryphon of James, and we looked at the writings of Josephus, and we were able to determine some of the things that are not actually historically accurate regarding the claims concerning Jesus and John the Baptist, and some things that are historically accurate. And when we were able to do that, we were able to learn something about Jesus, something about his character that stood out to us hopefully more clearly than ever before, also in its true character, more so than ever before. And that gave us some insight into Jesus and how Jesus really, Jesus the man, the person, did not view himself as being greater than other people. He viewed John the Baptist as being as great as he was, if not better, and he viewed others as having the potential to do as good or better than he has done. And he really, he really viewed people highly. He viewed himself in not any sort of prideful way at all, or any sort of exalted way either. He really, really did view us as equals to himself in principle. Of course, he recognized that we are behind, and that like he was living by higher principles, whereas all the people surrounding him were living by very low principles, or at least most. Maybe not John the Baptist. Certainly doesn't seem like he viewed John the Baptist as living by low principles. But when he looked around him, you could see a world of darkness, and he had, he wasn't abiding by these false principles that most others were. So he recognized that, and in that sense, you could see that he was living better than they were, but he didn't view himself as inherently better or inherently more valuable or inherently greater. He viewed others as the same as him, and him as the same as them in terms of inherent value and potential. And through that, we get a glimpse of how the Heavenly Father and the Heavenly Mother and the Heavenly Daughter view us as well. They do not view themselves as being inherently greater than everyone else. They do not view themselves as having so much more potential than everyone else. They try to draw us up. They see that we are in this depth of darkness and we are in this moral low, and that this moral low has held us down from reaching our full potential greatly. But they seek to lift us up from that depth and to raise us to their height. They don't want to raise us up to a place where now we can be their lowly servants and serve them better, rather than being people who are so messed up because of our own sin. It's not their goal to have better workers or better servants. No, they want to lift us up because they want to serve us. And when we are lifted up and when we are morally on par with them, when we can live a life that measures with the life of God, which Ellen White emphasizes we are to do, then we will want to serve them too. We won't be self-exalting, just like they won't be self-exalting. We won't think that we're better than others, just like they don't think that they're better than others. That's how it has to work. That's how it's got to be. And the idea that our Heavenly Family views others as lower than themselves and views themselves as just being the best and inherently better is part of the misconception of God that the devil has been promulgating for all these thousands of years and wants to perpetuate, so that we, on one hand, do not view ourselves as having the potential, even with the grace of God, to actually live a life which measures with the life of God, and on the other hand, so that we view God as being ultimately high and mighty. And that's a type of person that none of us ultimately want to be around. None of us really want to be around someone who is just viewing themselves as just inherently better than us. Even if they aren't hateful to us because of it, still, do we want someone looking at us with pity forever, thinking, oh, these poor, lowly humans, if only they were as good as I? No. That type of attitude is one which is actually unappealing and unattractive for good reason. It's hard to relate to someone like that who's viewing themselves as ultimately better. And the message that we got during the new moon and since is that that is not how our Heavenly Family views themselves, and it's not how they view us. And they really do view us as having the potential to live lives which measure with their own and to be morally on par with them. And Jesus, as we read in the Apocryphon of James, said to his disciples, do better than I. Become better than I am. Jesus saying that, in principle, is the same as our whole Heavenly Family saying that. That's the character of our Heavenly Family. They are the sort of beings to say, no. don't think that we are so much greater than you. Don't think that we're all that and we can do all the things that we can do and we can be so good as we are just because we are gods or something like that. And you guys have no chance of living a life that measures with ours. No, they're telling us, live a life that measures with ours. Then we will help you to do so. Become better than us, and we will help you to do so. Now, of course, they're striving to be better and better and better all the time because that is part of the nature of God, constant advancement. And so, because of their principle, I'm not saying that we ever will become better than God or anything like that. No, no, no. I'm just saying that we have to understand that we can be constantly advancing just as much as they are. And we can live lives that measure with their life. And they are not inherently some sort of superior being beyond our reach. No, the whole point of the incarnation is to take us and lift us up to live lives that measure with the life of God. So I know that these concepts and these ideas have some sorts of semblances of things that we have known. Like we've all known that Jesus said, greater works shall you do. But we haven't really allowed ourselves to fully accept that. So laying it out as plainly before us as our Heavenly Family has been this month may come across slightly as a shock or as something that we might be hesitant to accept. But truth is truth, and this is why it's important for us to deal with reality on its own terms, no longer being spiritualists, no longer asserting our concepts of a reality that does not match the way things really are. No, as people of truth, we need to recognize the historical Jesus and what we can learn from him. And there's much more. There is so much more to learn from the historical Jesus, from the real Jesus, rather than simply a portrayal of Jesus as viewed through the lens of tradition. And this is our opportunity before us. So it's a wonderful thing. Anyway, with all that said, does anyone have any comments or questions related to these grand and beautiful topics?
I don't have anything really profound to say, but I was just thinking the whole time you were explaining what they wanted us to know about them again. And it's really interesting in order, because they wanted this presented during new moon. I mean, that's important. They want us to know that they really are here for us. They really do understand totally what we go through, and they're here for us. They want to do everything possible to help us overcome whatever it is in our lives that needs to be overcome. Now, I'm sure you're not saying we will ever be creators or anything like that, but to truly be able to say they are our friend, they would have to be very humble, very, very humble, and very generous. And there's a lot. It just makes me feel like, wow, because when we do stumble and fall or get allow ourselves to be provoked to even a mild anger, just even in thoughts. Oh, I wish I'd have said this, or I could have said that, or whatever. Then later, because we're all the studying we're doing, we're trying to learn to be better than that. And so then and we rightly should know that we're doing wrong when we're thinking or doing things wrong. But Satan wants for us to beat ourselves up so bad that we think there's no hope, that they're so far above us that we could never attain it. And so then he wants us to feel like we're un savable hypocrites, you know. And anyway, it just makes me feel very blessed to have had them share this information with us, and to know that they really are there for us, and they're um, wanting to encourage us to keep on keeping on, and just keep trying, and to be overcomers. So I may not have said everything quite right there, but um, that's that's part of what I see right now.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. There's two elements of what you said that I'm going to comment on because I think it's just an opportunity to understand a couple elements better. And one of them, you mentioned that they are very humble. And I want to mention, yes, absolutely, they are very, very humble. But it's important to keep in mind that our Heavenly Family is not actually um, telling us these things about their character just as part of their humility. I mean, yes, it is part of their humility, and humility is a deep, important part of their character, but their humility is not like the humility that we're used to. You know, often we think of humility as in kind of like downplaying our own greatness or something like that. Um, so let's say someone made something magnificent, like some like awesome carpentry thing or a sculpture. We'll go with sculpture. They made some sort of sculpture and it's just beautiful and amazing. And someone comments on how beautiful it is. And in order to quote unquote be humble, they kind of downplay it, like, oh, well, I'm really not that good or something. That's kind of a dishonest humility and isn't ultimately a genuine humility. Genuine humility is so rooted in truth. So when our Heavenly Family says, we are not inherently greater, you can be as good, you can live lives that measure with us, you can, become greater than us. Like when they say that as a command, like Jesus in the talk on of James, become better than I. Okay, when they say those things, they aren't trying to be humble. They aren't trying to downplay themselves. They view things like that because it's true. They don't view things like that because they're trying to be nice or they're trying to be humble or anything like that. They only view things in terms of reality. And so when they are taking the position that they are not inherently better and that we are just inherently some lower order or something like that, they take that position because it's true, not because they're being humble. And it's really important for us to keep that in mind. I know that's a hard thing to wrap our minds around sometimes, but as Teresa pointed out in one of our meetings, the reason why it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that is because we're so used to having a magical conception of God. And I think that may have somewhat influenced your comment on how we will never be creators. Well, what does that mean? Like, what are they really creators in some magical sense, and we can't be? And I know that it's not that you were thinking of it overtly as, oh, they're magical, but ultimately, what's at the root of that? What is at the root of thinking, oh, they're creators and we will never be creators? Well, isn't creating just ordering, bringing structure, organizing, naming, giving purpose to things? Aren't those all things that we can do? What's this special thing that they can do that apparently we just can't? It's kind of like
it's so
the
crazy
thing at the root of that.
Yeah,
right?
listening to you say that is just so crazy because even though I'm totally on board with that, I still, I grew up as
Yeah.
Adventist
Yeah.
and have been Davidian for 25 years, you know, and it's like, it's so easy for me to still view what you're saying, like from someone's perspective who doesn't, like, good again, have all the foundations of where you're coming from. And
I totally understand.
the world needs to understand this, but at the same time, I'm just going to put it in very uncensored terms. It's almost scary to think what people are going to think about what you're saying, because many people are going to misunderstand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And if they realize what you mean, many people will still misportray what you're saying because they just don't like the branch or whatever. They just don't like you or something. But yeah, the cosmogony study that we have, and what does it mean to create, and all these different things. I think, didn't we go through that in the community room as well?
We did, yeah.
Oh, such good studies to lay the foundation and to explain and show very clearly, even from the Bible, that the Bible does not promote creation out of nothing, and it doesn't promote magical God. Well, there might be some passages in the Bible, you know, because
it's possible, yeah.
There might be some stuff in the Bible that isn't even inspired. You know, maybe it shouldn't be there. Somebody else put it in there. But anyway, just so interesting to hear these things being said as I try to listen as someone who hasn't heard this before.
And I know also, I will say, that I'm sure, especially for you, Teresa, since you are probably, well, definitely more familiar with what I say and how I say what I say than anyone else, you know how careful I am to present subjects to people in a way that is least offensive.
Oh, yeah.
You know, yet I also am careful to try and make sure that no one, especially no one who accepts the message, misses the real thrust of it. And this is why, you know, Jesus, sometimes he had to portray things in a way that was very bold and blunt. Now, I'll say something now. This does need to be historically investigated to see if Jesus actually said something like this.
Yeah.
But the portrayal that we have of Jesus in John chapter 5 and 6, where he says, eat my flesh and drink my blood,
oh yeah,
the way that's portrayed is he is making very bold statements that are hard to grasp and that are seemingly just crazy and possibly even blasphemous. And yet, he still said, doubtless knowing that it would be taken like that. And I will say that even if eat my flesh, drink my blood, even if that is not something which Jesus literally said, one thing that I think we can say is that he did say things that were taken to be very blasphemous or very, kind of like not honoring God like one should honor God. So the things that he said were taken like that. That is something that we have multiply and independently tested, even if the actual sayings differ. But that was one of the reasons why people had a problem with him. But again, let's just remember the reality of this. There is no such thing as magic. There is no such thing as a God just pooping things into existence out of nothing. When we understand what creation is, and it's about ordering, and again, the word create or creation, the English word is not the best word to use. If I was to produce a translation of ancient Jewish scriptures, I would studiously avoid using the word create and its variants in the translation because it does not accurately convey to modern readers what the ancient scriptures had in mind. Modern readers, when they hear that, they think creation from nothing, putting something into existence, which is a magical perspective. And that is not what these ancient writings are at all attempting to say. And when we look at what they are actually attempting to say, it's better to translate the word bara, which is the Hebrew word typically translated create, as something like separate or distinguish. And when we have that in mind, and when we see the actions that Elohim is described as doing the work of quote unquote creation, we see that afterward humanity is actually made and they are supposed to partake in this same type of behavior. So, God names things and separates things and organizes things. And that's creation. And guess what? What is the work given to Adam in the story of Genesis 2?
Oh, very interesting.
To name things, to kind of like organize the world of living organisms. And it's like, okay, that is a work of creation. God is actually getting Adam to participate with him in this creative work.
Yeah, the word create just isn't the best, because even me, and I understand completely where you're coming from and what you mean. Mm-hmm. But every time you say the word create or creation,
it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It rings wrong. It doesn't work.
Exactly. So the better way to put it, it's not that we will be creators or something like that. It's that our heavenly family are not creators in the sense that we usually think of it. It's just not the best way. But there is another way that we think of creation. Imagine this. We think of creation like creating a masterpiece. Wow, this person created a masterpiece. And what is that? They are organizing something. They are bringing about beauty. They are structuring something, making some sort of meaningful something,
Right.
That's another way that we use the term. Our heavenly family, they are creators in that sense. Not in the magical sense, but in that sense, sure, they're creators. And we can be creators like that too.
That's really helpful.
So, good. I'm glad that was helpful. Yeah, so, that's just another kind of thing that we're thinking that there's this kind of magical thing that only God has, and that we can't do that. No, that's not the case. And we actually, if you think about it, usually we don't think of some of that stuff as just applying to God. Some of it, usually we think of angels as being able to do magic too, right? When really, magic just doesn't exist. God can't do magic, angels can't do magic, we can't do magic either. But the things that God does that we think are amazing, God does using physical means, which means some sort of technology, and angels do the same thing. We are supposed to be able to do those same sorts of things too. We are supposed to learn. And this is the whole idea of humanity being vicegerents of God. It means that we're supposed to be representations of God. This is all kind of bound up in being in the image of God. It's representing God, mimicking God, doing what God does. So again, it's these kind of barriers that we have, and it's all rooted in this separation between the natural and the supernatural. But we have to remember, our heavenly family, our physical, biological, and I'm going to say it in the most straightforward, blunt way, our heavenly family, they are physical, biological animals. I know that sounds weird and wrong, but it's true. Just like we are physical, biological animals. Ecclesiastes, by the way, says that we humans are animals. And we have to remember, all an animal is a multicellular organism with a digestive system. That's all it is. That's what we are. That's what our heavenly family is. They eat. They're described as having physical bodies with digestive systems and all of that. And this is how they are portrayed. They are animals. We are animals. We, as human beings, are not inherently superior or more valuable than, let's say, ostriches or peacocks or butterflies or dogs or whatever. It's not like we're just No, we're different, that's for sure. But we're a whole lot more like our heavenly family potentially, and they're a whole lot more like us than maybe we are as compared to cats or dogs or something else. Um, but we're all real, physical, biological entities, and the reason why I use the word animal and why I could just say biological entities. Why do I mention animal? The reason why is to emphasize how unmagical that is. Like it's really physical. Like when we use a word like animal, that is very physical. Like even human doesn't sometimes cut it because people often think of humans as apart from animals. And the reason why that is because we imagine that humans have this special thing, which has its roots in having some immaterial soul or an immaterial spirit. But we don't have that, just like other animals don't have that. And so thinking of us as animals is valuable in that it gets rid of that whole concept of an immaterial spirit or immaterial soul or something like that. It pulls us to the strictly physical, to the strictly biological, which is in fact what we are. And that is what our heavenly family is too. And that's why it's helpful to use a word like animal. Again, it's not derogatory. Why would we think that it's derogatory to think that we are animals or our heavenly family are animals? Like, why do we have some negative view of an animal? Being an animal is an amazing thing. It's a beautiful thing. I love being a multicellular organism with a digestive system. There's nothing bad about that. There's nothing bad about that for us. There's nothing bad about that for our heavenly family. Let's celebrate being animals. It's a wonderful thing, and it captures how physical we are and how physical they are.
And it also conveys the nature of love, because thinking that we're not animals is what leads to animal cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking that we're somehow better than other living creatures. I'll avoid the word animal for this purpose,
Sure.
but thinking that we're better than other living creatures is what also leads to slavery.
Absolutely.
Because if you think of yourself as a human being as superior to an animal, and so animals are deserving of whatever you deem appropriate to do to them, well, that's the same attitude that slave owners have for slaves of any culture. I'm not just talking about North American slavery. Any culture in the history of the world who has had slaves has had the idea that somehow they're better and that it's like okay to abuse this other living creature simply because you view them as an animal and you're not an animal, right? So our heavenly family, thinking of themselves as the same worth as human beings, to me is the same idea of human beings viewing and understanding that other animals have the same worth as themselves. And if we could see that, well, surely that would eliminate treating other human beings with cruelty and disrespect and that sort of thing.
Exactly. All of this, to learn these lessons, serves to get rid of even the very foundation of what becomes all of these isms of, so-called racism, as though there were different races of humans. So-called racism or sexism. People have all these negative perspectives, and yeah, virtually everyone recognizes today, now there are exceptions to this, but most people on earth today recognize that racism is a wicked thing, that it's bad, and that it isn't in harmony with reality. It's a false view. And more people are recognizing that sexism is bad. Well, how about speciesism? Why are we viewing these species, other species, as being less than we are and deserving of, cruel treatment and things like that. No, that's awful. In order to have...
Yeah, let's just raise them up, kill them, and eat them even.
That's right.
Okay, that might be getting too far into philosophy of discussion that might lead us a little bit off track. I don't know.
Well, no, I think it's a valuable point, though, right? And it does connect with other things, like we've talked about animal sacrifice, and all of that is part of our discussion of the character of God. And it's like, we have these passages with God saying that He does not like sacrifice and does not like the slaying of animals, and in fact despises it. We have passages in these ancient writings that say that, and it's like, one who kills a dog or one who kills a pig or whatever, it's like one who kills a man. It's like God views it as the same. These lives are equally valuable, and if you kill one, it's just the same as if you took another. Even in Genesis, in the P account, describing basically if a dog kills a person, for example, their blood will be required by God, or another way to translate is God will inquire of it at their hand. And like, if you look at even the laws in the Pentateuch, there are places where it's like human life and animal life gets put on the same. See, there I went. Human life and animal life is those two different things. Mm-hmm. Human life and other animal life is put on the same playing field, and like, humans and animals can both be held accountable for taking the life of others. And it's like, man, this is a big deal. Again, not every passage in the Pentateuch shares that same sort of perspective, but we really have to get down to reality to view these things right. And when we see our Heavenly Family as they are, and how really they are not magical, and neither are we, and we're all real, physical, biological beings that are actually, in fact, multicellular organisms with digestive systems, aka animals, and that no animal is greater than another, in other words. It kind of gives us a reality check, and it's like, oh, wait, they are actually so great and so wonderful, even though they don't have any sort of magical abilities. Well, yeah, we can live lives that measure with theirs. We can have their same principles, their same everything, morality, whatever, and really progress with them together through the rest of eternity. Our Heavenly Family is really not trying to lift themselves up over us. They're trying to lift us up to them, to be with them. And to do so, they, specifically Jesus, lowered himself down to us. It's a beautiful thing. So, anyway, we've been on for an hour now. Does anyone have any comments or questions in reply to this? And we won't go on for a whole lot longer, but I understand if anyone has a comment or question.
I just wanted to comment how relieved I feel to know that they did not command the animal sacrifice, because to me, I think killing an animal is the origin of cruelty. That's where it most likely have started, and to think that our Heavenly Family were the founders and commanders of killing an animal, it just didn't make sense to me. Because look at what the world's like now. It just branched off from there. And because people that, I come from a culture where we raise an animal and to kill it and eat it. We've bought a goat and raised it and considered as a pet, and had to kill it and eat, and you just accept that, right? And so now it's just all making sense. This is so comforting to know the revelation um, of the true characters of our heavenly family. So praise the heavenly family.
I will say amen to that. I do have one qualifier, though, and that is that it depends when you say that they have not commanded animal sacrifice or whatever. It depends on what you mean by that, and it depends on what facts manifest themselves. In other words, while I think we have determined that our heavenly family hates the killing of animals and that they did not, that they basically were not the ones who originated the idea of killing animals or anything like that, we have not yet determined whether they did give a system of laws which included commands regarding animal sacrifice. And that's something important to keep in mind, that that's something that we have not yet been able to determine and which we still need to determine. Again, if they did do it, though, if they did give a system of laws which included in it commands for animal sacrifice, the purpose would not have been to promote it. It would have been because people would be doing it anyway, and it would be to limit its extent, and knowing that they were going to do it, to at least prevent them from doing it in certain ways and doing it in homage to other gods and different things like that. So those are things that we still need to determine. Again, a couple of the options that we discussed in previous studies. One thing is the possibility that our Heavenly Family never at all gave any command related to animal sacrifice other than don't do it. The other possibility is that knowing that their people were going to do it, they gave a system that included commands related to animal sacrifice in order to put certain limitations on it, and since they were going to do it anyway, to have them do it in a way through which they could teach them lessons, eventually ending to bring an end to that system, and when their people would be ready, to give them a way to learn those lessons without the killing of animals. So anyway, that's my qualifier.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
The thing that makes it possibly kind of harder for people to not jump from one extreme to the other, or to, I think really what I'm wanting to say is one thing that could make it hard for a person to kind of follow this slower transition and not view it as jumping from one thing to another is potentially a lack of understanding of, or even a lack of awareness of the documentary hypothesis. And just being in the habit of viewing every book in the Protestant canon as, well, of course it's a product of inspiration, it's in the Bible, rather than going through and testing it. And as we've seen over the last couple of years, in investigating the documentary hypothesis, it's very compelling, and it's certain that the first 5 books of the Bible could not have been completely written by Moses. They probably contain something, or at least they claim to have some quotations from what Moses wrote a couple times, but nowhere does it even claim that these books were written by Moses. But we're just in the habit of viewing them as written by Moses. They're a product of inspiration, and like I say, habit reverts us back to thinking, oh, well, of course, right as soon as sin happened, God performed the first sacrifice. That's what I've thought for most of my adult life,
And actually, that's not even in the Bible. Mention that. It's not in the Bible.
Right, but see, that how ingrained it is, I don't even remember that, even though we've gone over it. You know, my mind reverts to this way of thinking because I thought it for so long and had been taught it in Adventism and Davidia and have just understood it to be true. So you've got that, and then you've got the account of Cain and Abel bringing sacrifices. And, well, Cain was punished for not bringing an animal sacrifice. His sacrifice of vegetables wasn't even accepted. God didn't want that. God wanted a life. God wanted blood. You know, that's what it seems to portray. Well, of course it originated with God, with Yahweh, here, which is proof right here, right? But in understanding the documentary hypothesis and the implications of that, we have to question, okay, which source does this story come from? There's several different sources, several different accounts of creation, so to speak, even throughout the rest of the Psalms, which aren't even part of the Pentateuch, don't even have the tradition associated with them as having been written by Moses, and yet, you know, they're there. There's all these other creation accounts, but we don't ever think about that. But we go back to these kind of Pentateuchal creation stories, and that's our go-to. That's what we automatically revert to. And so we'll either, you know, like, this is the way the devil tries to do. He either tries to take us from one extreme or the other and kind of bypass the whole recognition of just questioning, investigating, testing. And if he can't do it to the individual willing to change their mind on something or willing to be corrected, he'll do it to people outside looking in and accuse people who are willing to test and investigate of jumping from one extreme to another, you know, even if they're not.
Sure.
So these old habits of thinking a certain way creep into everything.
Absolutely. That's why we have to dominate our way of thinking with truth, because that's the only way that we will escape error and its pitfalls. So with that said, we should really wrap up pretty soon here. And again, we will continue on this discussion tomorrow night. So if anyone has, you know, further comments, especially if it kind of goes in a different direction, obviously still on the same general topic though, then we can do that tomorrow night. I will give one more opportunity though. If anyone does have like a last comment or question, like especially if you feel really pressed on it, or if there's something troubling you about the discussion or whatever, feel free to mention it. All right. Well, would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, just want to express how grateful we are for your leading us away from falsehood into truth and light, and for getting us really acquainted now with your character so we could really be confirmed that you are the gods of love and truth and all those good things. So be with us during the Sabbath. Help us to gain more truth in our time with you. And we just want to pray that you comfort those that are needing it, and help us to just advance so we could be ready as a people you need us to be. In the name of Branch, amen.
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 All right. Love you all. Shalom.
Happy Sabbath.
Night.